Okay. Um, Back
Uh,
in 2020, we did a series of studies that had actually started in 2004, ran through, and were finally published in 2020, where we tested over 1,000 energy practitioners in this country. We have somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million energy practitioners of well over 3,000 styles of practice, of straight energy work all the way through shamanic work. And traditional healing of various kinds. The incorporation of traditional methods into the healthcare environment, because health costs in the US are catastrophically high, is a potential to spread the costs, number one, and reduce overall costs, number two, if there's validity to the process. So the initial work that we did, we tested the 1,000 practitioners plus and developed a 13-point test with 2 additional question type tests. It was empirical data. We actually used a whole series of devices in the process. We used data logging multimeters, triaxial extra low frequency magnetic field meters, RF spectrum analyzers. It was hardcore frequency data assessment that was done as part of the process. One of the things we noticed, because we asked practitioners to change the pH of water, and practitioners in this country really are not trained to do that, was that we got anomalous results. And so we went back over the course of the last year looking at what was going on. The reason for that is this: if you can change the pH of water and make the environment more alkaline, if you can target that process to the blood of the body going to particular organs, for example, then you can reduce inflammatory response. And what's the big killer? It's inflammation. So if, as an adjunct to traditional Western care or to more comprehensive Western care, you can reduce inflammatory effects in a positive way, that's an important finding. So we developed a new experiment. It was approved by the National Foundation for Energy Healing, and we tested 65 participants, 24 men and 41 women. And out of that group, 29 produced the results that are expected by normal physics. Now, when we went into that process, we had practitioners that had a minimum of 3 years of professional practice. That defines a practitioner as doing 6 to 12 paid healings per week for a minimum of 3 years, at least 48 weeks a year. We utilized glass jars. We did not utilize plastic. The containers were filled with pH normal water, and that was tested to confirm. They were also, the water was conditioned to the environment. It was left open. The big containers were left open a minimum of 12 hours, generally 24, prior to testing. The meters were all calibrated prior to the testing, and we were testing in multiple environments. So this was not a single shot, one particular place, and we did everybody all at once. We actually tested, it's either in 8 or 9 different environments. Groups varied in size to from a single participant doing the testing to 8 participants at a time. And the standard expectation that we would have is that when alkalinity increased parts per million of the dissolved solids in the water would actually go up, and when acidity would increase, parts per million would go down. That's what we expected. That's what we got with 29 of the participants. We did use the same pH meters and parts per million meters for each test So the practitioner would do the test. The pH and parts per million would be tested at the start and then tested at the finish. And that same set of meters would be used by each person. And then between the test cycles, everything would be recalibrated to be sure that we were clean. One of the problems with the small digital meters that are currently on the market, places like Amazon.com, is a lot of those meters are unstable. So one of the things that we had to do was make sure that we had stable digital meters for the testing process. All of the participants were in a position to work for 10 minutes, and the score sheets for each practitioner were written at the time of the data taking. We also videoed a number, we had special permission to video a number of the participants in the process. There was an observer. They were 12 to 18 feet out off of the table so that hopefully we limited the experimenter effects. And the practitioners were still observed. A practitioner was dropped if they put their hand over the top of the jar that contained the water, if they coughed into the jar, if they stuck a finger into the water in the jar, any of those kinds of things, they were asked to leave the process. And we actually only had like 2 or 3. I need to go back and look, and I didn't write it for this presentation. I apologize. But it was not a significant number. Practitioners could place their hands anywhere on the outside of the glass container. They could not breathe into the water. They couldn't put the hands over the top of the glass container. And they could put their hands, glass containers were placed on a sheet of blank white paper in front of them on a table. They could put the hands on the 2 sides of the paper if they preferred. They were asked to please dialogue with the water. That's a traditional practice, to dialogue with elements and to dialogue with the water and ask only the water in the glass container to make the change. In that way, we hoped that we would get something within 10 minutes. And in fact, we did. Every person that completed the study, the 65 that completed the study, actually exceeded the error rate of the devices, the measuring devices, and in terms of performance, and did perform, actually produced a change that was past the error rates. And in some cases, it was a quantum effect, which was actually very, very interesting to see. They were, the tests were done for a period of 10 minutes. And by and large, it was very interesting to watch the process, because practitioners that produced anomalous results, in some cases, what we saw was the water appeared to almost boil. But there was no change in temperature. When we went back and pulled some of those separate from this experience, individuals in to do some additional looking, there actually was no change in temperature in the water. Now, I can't confirm that it happened at the time of these tests, but when we went back and looked, they did produce water that looked like it was in a rolling boil, and did not actually change the temperature. So that was also very interesting in terms of the agitation of the material. One of the things that we consistently expect is that the dissolved solids, as I mentioned before, will increase. And so within 10 minutes, you're actually asking people to pull out of a local environment water that's already conditioned to the local environment. Something out of thin air, essentially, which is going to change those parts per million, the dissolved solids in the water. So what we're actually looking at is early stages of transmutation of matter. And as I said, we did see it in all 65 individuals that were tested. This is a picture of the actual pocket-sized pH meter. And The digital meters are tested in manufacturing buffering solutions. We only used glass. The water had to be preferably 48 hours, but as I said, it was a minimum of 12 hours in the dust-free environment. We did not use distilled water. We used pH normal water as a start, a 6.8 to a 7.2. And the practitioner was allowed to go either way. They could go more alkaline or more acid as they chose. The original tests back when we started back in 2004, I paid for these studies out of my pocket. We couldn't afford the digital meters, so we actually started with swimming pool test strips to see what the pH was at that point. It was very important in terms of replication to calibrate the device prior to each run, to not touch the surface of the glass with the measuring devices, only test in glass, rinse the glass well, let it fully dry so there's no residue from the meters or from the practitioner effects between runs. We actually sterilized the glass between runs. And this is a parts per million meter. So total dissolved solids, looking at the water quality. So we had, as I mentioned, a number of anomalous changes. We had things that make no sense. We had a decrease. The pH became more acidic with no changes in parts per million. We had an increase in the pH with no changes in parts per million. We had no change in pH with a decrease in parts per million. We had no change in pH with an increase in parts per million. We had an increase in pH with a decrease in parts per million. Physics says you can't do that. Increase in the pH with decreased parts per million, and actually in 2 cases the parts per million went to 0, and they essentially stripped all of the dissolved solids out of the water. Again, physics says you can't do that, and to try and do that even with pretty intense distilling equipment, there usually is a small percentage of dissolved solids in the water. So this was a very, very unusual finding. So this is a summary of the effect sizes, the median range. You'll notice the confidence interval was 95% on all of this data. And we had, for example, the pH going up with the parts per million going down went to 0.0006. So we had 0.001 on both pH and parts per million going up. When we saw, because of the way parts per million are mentioned, when there's a significant change in parts per million, it actually is a quantum field effect. So we were literally watching real-time practitioners produce quantum field effects. We don't know how this will end out long-term, but obviously the next step is to look at whether or not they can change blood real-time, whether in a test tube or in an actual person, and they have to do blood draws in sequence. And whether or not there are secondary effects when we do the blood analysis. So that's going to be the next step in this process. In terms of parts per million, again, we saw significance in a number of them, some of them because we only had a single subject that produced the results. We didn't see significance the same way, but it was unexpected, to say the least, to see this kind of range in the changes that were involved. If we can definitively show that a practitioner can go forward and change the alkalinity and to a more alkaline blood state, utilizing that in a clinical setting is a potentially effective way to help reduce inflammatory response. in COVID, for example, where you get the cytokine storms, reducing an inflammatory response could be extremely important in terms of the health and safety of the patients. So it's going to be interesting to see where the data leads us long term. 86% of the participants placed their hands on the glass containers to make the shift. There wasn't any specific correlation between contact or non-contact with the glass containers. There is a common thing running through the US. It's also used in the UK and some in Europe, called intention setting. In this case, they did not do what is commonly called the power up process in public communication. And we specifically asked them not to use push waves. When you're manipulating energy, it's a little bit like water: a push, full stop, allow, grounding the flow, modulating the flow, changing the pitch, timbre, tone of the particular waveform. So all of those effects are possible, but we ask them to restrict themselves to a rolling wave where they dialed up to become more alkaline and dialed down to become more acid. The combined results, 0.003. So excuse me, a 0.03. So we've got significance in the data across all of the different responses. And it's going to be interesting to see what ends up happening further with the data, whether or not we can actually move this over into the clinical environment. Okay.